Thanks. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending where in the world you are joining us from today. I hope you're enjoying the plenary so far, and welcome to our working meeting. So this is for the Mapping the Landscape of Digital Research Tools working group. That's a bit of a mouthful, and today is going to be our repeat session. So for those who don't know me, my name's Connie Clare, and I'm the Community Development Manager at the RDA Foundation, but I've also had the privilege of working with this wonderful group now for about a year, since April last year. And the idea of today's session is to be able to showcase the draft deliverables. So the group's been working, particularly a small task group, has been working hard over the past few months to generate 3 different deliverables to map the digital research tools landscape. So we're hoping to share those with you and get some feedback, and also propose some ideas for next steps. So just a few logistics before we begin. I did post a few links in the chat for you, so you have access to the presentation slides and also the collaborative notes. So just to ask again, if you can sign in on page 8, that would be useful. Obviously the session's recorded, so you can watch it back, but we will have some time for Q&A and also open discussion, so you can post in the chat if you want to. Please do use the collaborative notes to capture the discussion and ask any questions. And of course, you can raise your hand and unmute. I also just want to mention that this is an RDA session today, so we will be adhering to the RDA's guiding principles and code of conduct. Hopefully nobody needs to report a breach during the session, but if for whatever reason you do need to, there are instructions in the collaborative notes for how to do that. So I also just want to share this bit of housekeeping, which is somewhat administrative, but you might notice that the Research Data Alliance is transitioning to a new web platform. So we do have a new group page. And if you haven't yet visited and you're an existing member, we do encourage you to reactivate your account. There are some instructions on the first page that you get to the home page. And from now on, you might notice that all of the mailing lists are now defunct, and we are using a groups post feature. And that here is flagged on the screen in red. So that's how I and the co-chairs will be communicating with the group going forwards. I would also like to just take this opportunity to say a big thank you and to introduce you to the co-chairs. So we have Francis Crawley and Hia Limri, who have, they're not actually here in this meeting today, but we do have Rory McNeil, and we are expecting Adam Vilesmore to drop into the call when he's able to. And Rory and Adam have really been integral to pushing this group towards the finish line. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Marcelo Garcia, who has been an active member of the group, especially during this drafting of deliverables, and he will be presenting during the session. And I also need to shout out to CJ Woodford, who's joined the call today. Thank you, CJ. So CJ is representing the Global Open Research Commons International Model Working Group, and he's going to present a bit about the mapping exercise that they've undertaken and ideas for possible collaboration. So thanks, CJ, for taking the time to join us today. I won't labour this, but I just wanted to share this slide because you might realise that this group is supported by Oracle for Research, and this is part of a public-private partnership model that the RDA entered into at the beginning of last year. So the idea is to support the facilitation of 2 working groups, and I have been able to facilitate with that support. And essentially nothing changes within the RDA, so the RDA outputs are still owned by the community and are openly available for adoption and reuse by anyone. But it is part of our strategic plan going forward, not to work in a silo, but to work across sectors and to engage with the private sector so that we can offer professional and timely facilitation to support the global volunteer effort and to accelerate data-driven development within the RDA. So you can read more about that through the slides. Okay, and sorry, I'm skipping through. Here's the agenda. So I'm going to hand over in 1 second to Marcelo, who will give you some background, introduce you to the working group and the aims and objectives. And then Rory and possibly Adam, when he joins, hopefully he does join, will give you an overview of the 3 deliverables. So the first deliverable was a harmonised research data lifecycle model and a crosswalk to existing models. The second deliverable was to create a categorisation schema of digital research tools. So this was like a landscape review to look at the various different tools that are available. And the third deliverable was to create a prototype, so like a visual interactive map that some stakeholders can use to navigate different types of research tool by research data lifecycle stage. And then CJ will give us an overview of his exercise on mapping from the GORCS group representative. We'll hopefully take some time for some Q&A where you can ask questions and get involved. And then Rory will present some next steps and ideas for possibly a follow-on group. So that will be good to have a discussion after that. We'll have a general discussion and then we'll close the session. So with that, I will hand over to Marcelo and I'll continue sharing for you, Marcelo.
Okay, so I think that we are trying to address here is the problem that each group creates its own tools, or there are a lot of tools that are available for research. And this creates a problem that when you try to start a new project, there are too many options, and then it's difficult to choose, right? So this is one of the main problems. I felt this overwhelming when I was looking for our solution here. So we start by to address this by categorizing all the research life cycles available. We found a lot of them, and we choose 5 based on their some characteristics that I think Rory will speak later. And then also after that, the organization, we decided to work on the tools, because in a certain way, although there are a lot of tools, it seems that it's very difficult that someone thought in a way, how can you streamline this operation? So the data from one tool to the next tool, so this life cycle became more smooth. So that was the second part, and that's what we do. I did a lot of time. And maybe finally, I think Connie was talking about the deliverables. That is, first deliverable was this consolidated life cycle. So we harmonized 5 of them of the 26 that we found. Then we try to characterize tools that are used. We made a big spreadsheet, a lot of examples, how if they're open source, not open source, they can talk to each other or not. And then finally, I would say Adam collect all this information and put in a graphical tool to make it easy to select the tool according to your stage on the life cycle. I think that's it. And so the third part will be our roadmap. So there was this characterization in October, then we start review in October, then we characterize in November. There was the map that start in December, then all January, and finally we are in this finalization step. I think that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcelo. Rory, do you want to start now presenting deliverable 1?
Yeah, no problem. So hi, everyone. And before I start, let me give a shout out to Connie. She was kindly introducing the rest of the members of the group who've been active, including the co-chairs and Marcelo. And Connie was, I think she might have described herself as a facilitator, but she was a lot more than that. She was a very active participant in the substance of the work as well. So in effect, another co-chair. So thank you, Connie. Yes, so as Connie and Marcelo have both alluded to, we had 3 deliverables, and we approached them, the development of the deliverables sequentially, because really the first was needed for the second, and the second was needed for the third, as you'll see as we go through this. So the first deliverable is called Harmonized Research Data Lifecycle Model and Crosswalk to Existing Models. And there are lots of, as everybody knows, there are lots of, too many actually, examples of the research data lifecycle, different models, and most of them are actually quite similar. They share a lot, but there are lots of ones out there. So we conducted a landscape review, and of the many that were out there, we identified 26 as we thought that was kind of our long list of relevant models. And then we selected 5 in order to take a deep dive on. And this again was a community process, so this was open. We had members of the working group of the co-chairs, but also quite a few others were involved in this as well. So then the next step was to identify common stages of the research data lifecycle, looking at these other examples for use to come up with our harmonized framework. And then we also had some discussion and work around definitions. Because again, different versions of the research data lifecycle that are out there use slightly different terminology. Next slide, please. So this is just a visualization of what I've just described. So on the left, you can see the 26 long list, then going into the 5 that we did a deep dive on, and then here's the actual visualization of the life cycle, which we came up with, and you'll see that these will be familiar because we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, but planning, collect, process, analyze, store, publish, etc. We originally had fund in there, but fund is important, so we kept the concept in, but it's not really part of the research data lifecycle per se. And then you can see there's also kind of mini feedback loops, which we tried to capture. So this is actually our second session. I thought I'd just add something which I think is important, which came up in the discussion in the first section, and that is, Adam's here. Adam.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about the delay.
Let me just finish this thought, yes, and then I'll pass over to you, if that's okay. Yeah. So some people said, "Oh, yeah. Well, look, there's been millions of versions of this research data lifecycle. Isn't this just another one?" And I would like to say emphatically, no. It's not just another one. I don't think anyone else has looked at the many that are out there, come up with a long list, then come up with a short list of ones which we gave reasons for thinking were particularly relevant, and then went to the next step, which I think Adam's going to jump in now and describe, of actually coming up with a hopefully well-considered, but at least a considered and harmonized model, a model of models, if you will. So if you're short of breath, Adam, I'm happy to continue, but if you're ready to jump in, feel free to take over.
If you do me one more minute while I just catch up to where we are, if that's all right, Rory. I apologize.
All right, I'll do the next slide. Perfect. Then as well.
Thank you.
Okay. So I mentioned the five shortlisted models, and here's the ones we selected: the RDM Kit Data Lifecycle, which is Elixir's, the Research Data Framework from NIST, the Data Curation Lifecycle from the DCC, and this Best Practice Data Lifecycle Approaches for Life Sciences, which is from EMBL, and then an institutional version of the research data lifecycle from UCL. Next slide. You ready, Adam? Or
yeah, I'm ready now. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, now I know where we are. Hello, everyone, and apologies again for dropping in slightly late. So once we'd assembled all these things in a row, we've gone over like kind of that overview of the process. We looked at each of these 5 candidate research data life cycles, and then did kind of a sparse mean squares n-dimensional alignment, mostly based on kind of like semantic values, but also looking a little bit at the kind of like sequential values as well, so that what you see in the outside ring on the right-hand side of this diagram is the final harmonized version, minus one little tweak that I'll talk about slightly later, which is where fund actually comes in the cycle. Which, spoiler alert, it's not actually in the cycle, it's a little bit outside. And then you'll see in the color-coded inner concentric rings, that's a bit of a rush. You'll see each of those labeled different life cycle research data life cycles, and the relevant parts of each of those life cycles. So what you can see is that we, as Roy's again pointed out, we took both an analytical and considered view and an approach that allows each of these RDLs, research data life cycles, to be part of the finalized kind of driving vision. But at the same time, there are crosswalks back to each of these, and that allows you to, relate the individual research data life cycles to the final harmonized one. And the point that Rory made about it being, an actual considered harmonization amalgamation stands to sustainability as well, because if we are aware of, or there is a new RDL that's developed, then we can incorporate that into the harmonization schema. We can build the crosswalks. And again, that stays as both a thing that is relevant and also can look at the kind of links into the wider work as well. Okay, next thing. Rory, are you all right going back?
Thanks, Adam. I'm jumping back to me. Yes. Yes, so that was the first deliverable, and now let's briefly go over the second deliverable, which is the categorization schema of digital research tools. So the description here, what we were trying to do, or what we did, was having defined the categories in the stages in the harmonized data lifecycle, to then begin to map categories of tools that were commonly used in each of the stages. So that was our objective here. And the process we went through was what we learned as we went, and we didn't exactly come out exactly where we thought we would. Let me see if I can share my screen and talk to one of the things which we used. And yes, there it is. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yep, got it.
Yeah. All right, so this is an example of one of the stages. So this is just an example. It's the plan stage. And so what we did was, and this was through kind of a collective exercise, which we worked on in a number of online sessions. And then I think, well, I know Andrea and possibly others who are here today were also involved in the in-person, the large active session we had at Salzburg. And we started out by just trying to think of, or different groups were set up, and the groups tried to think about what were the relevant tools that were used at particular stages of the life cycle. So here's an example of the plan one, and here are some of the tools that people came up with in these discussions. So that was kind of the beginning phase, and then we populated this. I guess you can see at the bottom. Actually, you can see all the different tabs with different. We did this for all of the different categories, and when we got this done, it was a bit of a mess, but it was in some cases there were a lot of tools listed. I think 45 was the most. In other cases, there was actually a paucity of tools. There weren't that many tools that we could think of, or that the groups could think of, which fit into the categories. But that's okay. And then the next step was actually to take the list of tools and then to try to determine, well, what categories do these tools fall into? So again, taking the plan as an example, you can see we have a long list of tools here, and we came up with 3 categories into which these, most of these or all of these fit. Data management planning tools, project planning tools, and then in this case, combined data management planning and project tools. So that was the next step in this process. And we chose 3 categories. In most cases, I think in all cases, we had 3 categories of tools for each stage of the life cycle. We then continued on, and for each category of tool, we chose 3 tools which we thought were representative and in fairly wide usage for each of the categories. So we have the stage, we have the category of tools, and we have examples of the tools. I'll stop sharing, and I think the next slide shows that graphically. Whoops, sorry, I need to get back. Whoops, just trying to find my way back to.
I'm just sharing for you, Rory, now. If you want, can you see my screen?
No, I'm sorry, I'm lost in my computer here, but no, I see it. Yeah, sorry. Yes, sorry. Yes. Actually, I think you can just jump to the next one, Connie, if you would. The next.
Mhm.
Yep. So, so this is just, as I said, this is just trying to graphically, visually describe what I said. For each stage, there are 3 categories of tools, and then for each category, there are 3 examples of tools. And really, this is the outcome of the second deliverable.
And maybe if I can just add, so if because everybody's got access to the actual deliverable spreadsheet itself, so on the first tab you will see that that is kind of reflecting this here in more detail. So you'll see the work that's been done there so far. That's the very first tab of the spreadsheet for anybody interested. On to deliverable 3 and back to Adam. Thanks, Rory.
Oh, there you go. It helps when you're off mute. Fabulous. Hello again. So, deliverable 3 is about thinking how we interact with the information that's been created. So, I've built an initial prototype to kind of convince the rest of the team, the working group, to be something that'd be useful. And then start to build the MLP, the minimum lovable, most lovable product, so minimum viable. Yeah, no, you don't want that. You want something that's lovable, right? You want something that like you actually want to interact with and work with. So some different interaction modalities. So as we have like different kind of contextual views of the information. And part of the thing that's really important is around about kind of curation and update. So that part of what the actual slightly longer term vision is around kind of respecting the value of the work that's been done to get us to this point, right? So again, sorry for missing the first few minutes, but you know, we've all done this kind of thing before, right? We've all created a spreadsheet which has a survey of a landscape, and then we've gone, gosh, we really must keep that up to date, and then we haven't necessarily actually done that. So part of the functionality and the things for a minimum lovable product is to have that view into kind of curation, sustainability, and being able to like update and interact with things so that we can see as things evolve, as the landscape changes, as the research data lifecycle perhaps itself changes, then we can address those in the actual information that we have. And moving on, what we'll see is that thanks to the joy of GraphViz and me trying to figure out how it all goes together, we have these different kinds of parts of the prototype. So we have like, you know, a start page with some basic information, some help, some other information. And off to the side of that, there's also the curation facility, which is not shown on this diagram. And then we've got the main view, which has a set of different selectors for the way that we interact with the information. So we've got graphical views, some text views, and some views of the actual schema itself. Now, the idea behind this is, again, that different people want to interact with this in different ways. We might want to look at coming from, I'm at a particular point in my research, I have this kind of bit of research data from doing these things. So what are the kind of tools that are available in context for this? We might want to be able to see like all of the tools, you know, kind of explode that view so as we can see where different tools sit in the research data lifecycle as we come to approach things. We might want to find out about like particular aspects of a tool, about the way that it works, the way which categories it sits in, and so on. So the idea was that, you know, we'd have these different ways of interacting with that information to like make it relevant and useful to different people. So moving on. So that's the schema view, and it's, you know, it's fancy, and we'll move on from that because I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to talk about schema. So this is a screenshot of the not broken one. So you'll again see this is the updated view of the Maldareth research data lifecycle. You'll see that at the top there, fund is just sitting a little bit out. And we've also got these 3 kind of like loopbacks as well. So one of the things that were expressed in a number of the RDLs that were harmonizing together was about this idea of like kind of the mini cycle that was, you know, between kind of collect, process, archive, store, and about how things moved, not just around that cycle. And it, you know, it's a directed graph, but there are some things that move kind of like back as well. Now, this is the bit where I have two versions of this code, one of which may or may not work, and one of which is this one. So if you give me 1 second while I just try to recompile my old R, if you can stop sharing for a minute, that'd be great. Thank you. And live, and it's if by magic. So let me just do that and that, and we'll see whether or not that update is now. See, now it says error nodes must have a detail. Right, okay, so that one's not working. So we'll go back to this one. And here we go, sharing the screen on that one. So as everyone is just trying to find the right share tab whenever you've got 40 windows open. That one. Okay, so here's the conceptual version, which hopefully you can see now, and only that window and nothing else. Which also has some of my Institute of Leadership tabs open on it, but there you go. And in that, you'll see, again, we've got this whole research data lifecycle. You'll see that conceptualize is a link, so you can click on that for more information and so on, in theory, but not in this particular model. And then we have this idea of kind of like the dynamic access as we kind of zoom into a particular part of the cycle, and we can say, oh, I need some more information about conceptualize and the various different categories that are available there. And then from that, we can also look at these different views around kind of the schema. And, you know, this is all kind of sortable, and we can figure out the different kinds of information. Now, again, some of this information that we collected is neither complete nor completely worked through. So although you can see there are many kind of like different characteristics of these individual tools, not all of them are available for all the things. And so we've been kind of thinking about how we limit ourselves in kind of the next iteration to make sure that everything that we produce and show on the screen is, you know, exactly known, categorized, worked through by the entire group. And then, of course, there's a text thing, which, again, we generate from that individual underlying information that we built up from the spreadsheets. So, so that, like, you know, goes on to MindMeister. I am not in any way associated with MindMeister. Many other mind mapping tools are available. Okay, so that's kind of like my first kind of like prototype sales pitch. And then, Connie, if you could just show I think I've got one more slide. I can't remember.
Yes, you have, but it's about the recommendations package.
All right, okay then. Cool. Okay, so then no, it's fine. So then the final thing to say about that, perfect, yes, go back to that one, is that I didn't then put the schema diagram on the slide. That's what it is, I remember now. Okay, so I'll pump that in the text shortly. So we've got a really kind of lightweight schema at the minute, which, as I said, has, you know, just the basic factual information on it. So what we've done is we've moved from having a set of spreadsheets with that information to having a visualization. That visualization is then currently built on top of SQLite. And then we've got some directed database calls, but we could also just turn those into JSON and pass the information around that way. And then that will also allow us, pardon me, some development of some RESTful characteristics, which will, again, allow for other parties to use and utilize the information and the various ways and strategies we have of storing that. I'll put the DDL for the schema in the chat shortly. And CJ, one of those things very quickly on how to determine whether a tool is interoperable or not. We had a bit of a punt, and that's one of the pieces of information that we really need to revisit very seriously. As I said, some of that information is not in like the best condition. So next slide then. Okay, so what we're doing in the final bit is building up a recommendation package. So we'll be talking about both the actual thing that we have done, so this work in producing that harmonized RDL, the way that we have got that information into those various spreadsheets and that information that's contained within there, and then like that final kind of categorization, the stages, the sub-stages, the exemplar tools for those. But what we'll also be doing is looking at kind of the practice and the ways of working as well. And also, some of those recommendations will be about reflecting back on the project, and sharing good practice that we could perhaps start to make some of this work a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more able to interact with on not such a specialist level as well. So some of the recommendations will be, like I said, here is the information that we have gathered, but also we'll have some around kind of how we gathered that information and how that might look in kind of a more generalized setting. Okay, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. So just before we do give the floor to CJ, actually, CJ, I think you started to answer that question, Adam, about interoperability. I don't know if Rory, if you wanted to add anything just to answer the question as well, or add anything else. I think this is something that we need to revisit in a future iteration, maybe.
Well, I'm planning to cover that in my comments about next steps. So rather than just repeat myself, I think I'll just say yes, indeed. I'll defer details until I get to the next steps.
Okay, we have got time for Q&A, but if you do think of any questions for Adam and Rory related to the work that's been described, you can pop them in the chat and we'll hand over to CJ then. CJ, do you want to, are you sharing screen or, oh no, I'm sharing for you, right? You want me to carry on?
Whatever, I was about to say, whatever works best for you. I can share my screen if that's easier.
Well, it's totally how you feel comfortable. So
all right, I'll share my screen and then I'll give it back, if that's all right.
That's perfect.
Just gonna make this a little bit wider. There we go. Okay, so thanks for inviting me to be here. I just want to make sure I have my presenter view up because I prepared for this a little bit late and I really do need my my notes. Whoop, there we go. So my name is CJ Woodford. I am a co-chair of the Global Open Research Commons International Model Working Group. Rory McNeil has been a really instrumental part of that group. He helped create the model, and we've had a lot of conversations on the side, as well as myself and Connie, on this group for this categorization of tools and mapping the digital tool landscape. And so I apologize to those who have been in multiple sessions where I've been talking, because you've heard me explain the Global Open Research Commons, I don't know, maybe like 6 or 7 times over the last week and a half. But for those of you that maybe haven't heard of it, I think it's important to cover before I jump into the mapping that I've done. So that's what I'll start with first. So the idea behind the Global Open Research Commons, or GORC, is that ideally it'll be an international connection between research commons. And Rory and I have had side conversations on commons versus cloud terminology, but really what we mean when we say commons here is kind of encapsulating all of that research infrastructure effort. So where you can interact with research objects, whether that's data, publications, software, on a shared platform where maybe you have infrastructure as a service or software as a service and other things that enable you to do research. So the idea is that you've got all of these commons or clouds that are sitting at a national, pan-national, regional, discipline-specific level, et cetera, different ways you can categorize that. And what we are hoping to do with the Global Open Research Commons is make them interoperable or work towards interoperability such that the research objects that are needed by any one researcher or research team are available everywhere at any time with the appropriate protocols and procedures in place. So we're also trying to consider things like controlled access management, especially for things like sensitive data or health data. And so there's 2 groups within RDA that work on this Global Open Research Commons idea. The first one that appeared first is the interest group, and they're working on a roadmap towards how do you get towards a Global Open Research Commons. So it's kind of a neutral space for people who are running these research infrastructures. These commons and these clouds can come together to discuss common issues and how do we get towards that interoperability on a global scale. The interest group spun up a working group, which was the International Model Working Group. And we were tasked with creating a model to say, what would a research infrastructure, commons, or cloud need to consider to be part of the GORC in the long term? And so the model was intended to be non-prescriptive. It's not a benchmarking. It's not a checklist. but it is a grocery list of things you could consider to have in your commons and kind of to go through and say what's important for us in our context as you're building or expanding. And so the idea was that the model telling you what might you need to consider would feed into the roadmap, which would say, how do you implement it? And all of that would feed into this global network of commons, the GORC. All right, so the model is built on top of the interest group's essential elements. So the essential elements were a set of typology and definitions that the interest group had endorsed last July. There's 9 of them, as you can see here, and I'll touch on each one a little bit. But the model is kind of structured on top of these 9 essential elements. And there's 400 items or so in the model itself. So they kind of build down in granularity or behind in granularity behind each of these essential elements. And so the idea is that each commons would need to have something in each element, but the model is telling you all the different things that you might want to consider. And then it's up to each context to say what considerations do you implement or move forward with for your context. So there's a set of human elements. The first one here, it's already in orange, is interoperability and standards and conventions. We also have governance structures. So how is it being run? Your rules and participation and access for all stakeholders, sustainability, both in terms of funding as well as community endorsement or activity, engagement with your stakeholders, and human capacity. So how is it running for internal personnel and such? Interoperability, standards, and conventions is also a technical element, however, because interoperability, standards, and conventions span all parts of the commons. And so even though we've got them separated out into essential elements, there are parts that are interwoven together. So also within technical, we've got compute, storage, network, and authorization authentication infrastructure, what also might be called ICT, services and tools, and your research objects themselves. We've also got some KPIs or key performance indicators and metrics in the model, which are ways that you can determine or that you might consider determining success of some of these things in the model as well as for your commons overall. And so what I wanted to touch on here, so that's all the background on the GORC. Sorry for kind of running through that. I have in fact been presenting this a lot over the last few days. So what we want to kind of dive into is the services and tools aspect. So when we were, when this group started ramping up, it was really clear that there was overlap or maybe complementary work being done between the services and tools task group that worked on the model and this particular group. And I keep calling you guys the Maldreth group. I know that Maldreth is one of the deliverables, but your name is very long to me. So I apologize for that. I just can't seem to keep it in my brain. So focusing in on the services and tools part, I did a exercise, and it really is an exercise on mapping between the GORC model for just the services and tools and the research lifecycle stages that you've identified in Maldreth, as well as considering the categories of tools that fall under them. So a couple of things before I show anything else with like the arrows going back and forth. On the left-hand side, and I sure hope it's on the left-hand side for you, where there's longer descriptions. So here, that's the categories, so top-level items in the model in the GORC model under services and tools. On the right-hand side, in capital letters, are the much shorter and concise research lifecycle stages in the Maldreth model. And so knowing that there's, in the GORC model, there's not just categories, but also subcategories, attributes, and features within each of these things. And on your Maldreth model, it's not just the research data lifecycle, it's also the categorization of tools underneath each one. This is a very high level attempt. So it does need to be revisited. It's only one way. I only mapped from Maldreth to GORC. I did not do GORC to Maldreth. I think that would look very different. And while there's not arrows to everything in the GORC model from Maldreth, that does not mean that Maldreth doesn't address those things in the GORC model. It's just that it wasn't a good mapping going one way. So I think overall, there's a lot of complementary work between the two models. I want to revisit this to do the mapping both ways and also to look at your more finalized deliverables, because I did this mapping a month and a half ago, and I think your version 0.3 of your tool categorizations was being filled out at that point and wasn't fully complete. So I think I was also mapping with an incomplete set of data. So I apologize in advance for that. The other thing I'll mention before showing these arrows is that the GORC model has a different audience than the Maldreth model. So we're focusing in on services and tools, which are very researcher-centric and researcher-facing, which is kind of what I've been interpreting the Maldreth model to be intended for, is for the researchers themselves. Whereas the GORC model is also intended for researchers, but it's also intended for anyone who's a stakeholder in Research Commons. So that's also the people who are developing them, funding them, and writing policy for them. So it's a bit of a wider audience. And so there's some different considerations to go in with that. All right. All that being said, what I found, which needs to be revisited, but happy to answer questions on. In the conceptualize phase, I found that that kind of fit within our category of services and tools that enable workflows and middleware. So this kind of, because conceptualize to me kind of focused in on brainstorming and collaboration. And those were all very specific examples that we had within the GORC model within that category. Plan fell within services and tools for direct research tasks. That shouldn't be surprising, as well as workflows and middleware. So things like project planning, data management plans, all of that fell within our workflows and middleware, as well as direct research tasks. Funding was workflows and middleware. So what we found, what I read within your model was that it kind of relied on search tools to find the appropriate grants and sustainability opportunities. And I kind of considered that as a workflow service. We didn't mention that specifically in the GORC model because sustainability is its own separate essential element that is kind of not really intended for the researcher-centric view. So that's where I felt that fit. Collect, back up into direct research tasks because you're collecting your data for analysis, which I know is a different thing down here, but that's part of the collection part. And we've got a data collection subcategory within these direct research tasks. Process, falling in within workflows and middleware, as well as direct research task again. This one specified access to ICT infrastructure, such as computing and the availability of ELNs. And the categories, to me, seem to be captured by analysis, processing, and visualization, in particular, the visualization subcategory of these direct research tasks. The metadata tools are also a part of the process stage. And they were one of the specific examples we had in workflows and middleware. Analyze, well, analysis is part of direct research tasks in our category, so that was a pretty obvious mapping for the direction I went with. Store, this to me implied repositories within direct research tasks, which is where that is, and as well as archive and management tools. And so that was spread, so everything that went within store was actually spread across two things for us because we considered repositories as their own category, but definitely captured within those two categories. Publish, went back to repositories in my understanding. Preserve, again, back to repositories as well as direct research tasks. This seemed to be completely encompassed by the repository category, but the transfer services could also be part of your direct research tasks. Share could be split across, again, into the repositories and direct research tasks. And I felt like that could also reasonably be discovery services, but it didn't quite fit with the categories that I saw in the examples that were in the model when I reviewed it. So that might change with the new version. Access. So to me, that meant the catalog of services and tools to see how you actually get access to things. And also depending on the intent of the share, it would definitely also fall into that security and identification services. Lastly, for transform, all the categories that I saw in there were really well mapped to subcategories of the direct research tasks that we have, specifically within data collection, research object management, and analysis, processing, and visualization. Okay, so that's my top level mapping that I've seen, and it's pretty clear that we've got a lot of overlap between repositories, services and tools for direct research tasks, and enable workflows and middleware. None of those are particularly surprising to me, given the intent of the Muldroth model, but I think that if we were to map the other way, we would see a lot more coming in from persistent identifier services into some of these, say, for publishing. It's just the fact that I went in one direction, so we want to go in the other direction as well. So where does this lead us in terms of our groups working together? Two-way mapping, because I only did it one way, and I think that's only half the story. I think the GORC working groups can really use the Muldroth model as well as all your GORC deliverables, especially that visualization that Adam showed. Very cool. We really want to look at that for a visualization of our own work. We definitely want to think about revisiting the services and tools essential element in our model. We want to harmonize and configure overlapping elements such as interoperability standards and conventions. I think that's much better described in the Muldroth model. We want to maybe bring that back into GORC, some of those ideas. And what I really like is the examples of tools that you've given in each category of tools within the Muldroth model. because one of the next things we're looking at for GORC is an implementation of these items, and not just their conceptual listing. On the reverse, the GORC International Model Working Group is going to be turning into the GORC International Implementation Working Group, or GORC 2. And our outcomes, which are many and need to be better refined, as well as from our planned profiles, should help inform new versions of Muldreth as well. And maybe more different categorizations of tools or different namings will come up. I think there might also be some cool side projects we could do across the two groups if this group does continue as another working group, or there's other spin-up working groups. We could think about making task forces across the groups, as well as maybe applying for doing things together with some Tiger projects. So we don't necessarily have to keep everything separate within in each group's box, but we could look at having some combined deliverables at some point. And I think that's it from me.
Thank you so much, CJ. That was really nice to have that presentation, having never seen it and never heard your ideas before. So I think that was wonderful. And I'm sure Adam and Rory feel the same. So we have time now for some Q&A. And I don't see anything in the chat so far, but I'll open the floor to our attendees first of all. Everybody's stunned in silence at all the information that they've just been given.
Someone's called Rory directly.
If sorry.
So I was just saying, sorry, Ray, I saw you pop off screen. I said someone's called Rory directly. It's that urgent a question.
No, there's the it's one of the things I've noticed. One commonality of the UK and the US is that in the summer the weather gets much better, but it also gets very noisy. People are mowing lawns and blowing leaves, and there was just a really noise. I was afraid the noise would interfere, but normally I guess I can hear it and you can't. But anyway, so listen, let me jump in because that was fantastic. If it's okay, just to reflect on a few points that that CJ made. Would it be possible to share your last slide, CJ, so we could talk to it? Because I think that would be a useful point of discussion.
I'm also happy to. Yep, that's fine. CJ's got it.
So first, let me. I was quite struck by your assumption, which I don't share, that we're dealing with that the Muldreth is. So the question is, the first thing is not about this slide, but your comment that the Muldreth is more aimed at researchers. So interestingly, in our first session, people said, well, who is this for? And we had kind of had two responses. Number one, it's not really for us to say who it's for. It's really for the market, the community, for people who might find it useful. And over time, that will determine who it's for. But I think our basic assumption is it's not for researchers. It's for exactly the same audiences that the GORC group thinks that it's likely audiences are, i.e. people that are putting together research commons, putting together research infrastructures, let's say, including research commons, which includes the various ones you mentioned, be they administrators, be they funders, et cetera. So to me, that's makes it even more compelling case for the various points you made in this slide, which is that we should work together closely. So I think so that's the first comment. The second comment is that the kind of yes to all the things you've said here. I might as well comment on it now since it keeps coming up. So one of the things which we had notionally said we would do is to kind of have another level of attributes like the GORC model does for each of the example tools. And the two of the key attributes are they closed source or open source? Are they interoperable or not? And because we really ran out of time, and both of those are important points, and interoperability in particular is a complex and thorny subject. So in order to really have a credible opinion on whether a particular tool is interoperable or not takes some work. We didn't have time to do it. So that's one of the things that we've earmarked, assuming we're able to go ahead and get a second working group going. And I think interoperability is something we're absolutely the GORC group has thought about it a lot. So it'd be interesting to comment interoperability from a tool perspective as well as a comments perspective, and try to put them together. So that absolutely, I think, is a really fruitful area for joint collaboration. Yes, to your other things, and I thought it's interesting. To your last bullet point there, indeed, I don't think there are many examples. There are examples of different groups in RDA working together, but I'm not aware of any kind of really joint ventures. And it seems to me this could be a strong case for forming a kind of joint venture. And we've already discussed in this group going out for Tiger support. And if you're interested, I know that GORC is thinking about that too. If we could even consider putting in kind of a proposal for joint Tiger support to inform some of the things that are here. So I'll shut up. But those are some kind of instant reactions to your fantastic comments.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I think, Roy, that's an interesting point. So I think I was assuming that Muldreth was researcher-centric because you're coming from almost a bottom-up approach of looking at the tools first, which sounds researcher-centric to me, but I very much see how it can be used by other stakeholders. So I really appreciate knowing that now, because I would map it differently in the future. So that's really interesting and really cool. I would also say, like, yeah, this task force idea is brand new, brought up in the National Data Services Interest Group, has never been done before, as far as I know either. So I'm happy to explore those options, those new novel ways of groups working together. Definitely see how that can go.
Thanks, CJ. Thanks, Rory. So before we move on to the proposed next steps, which I think we've already started to discuss really with this collaboration, does anybody else have any other questions about the deliverables that have been presented or the methodology? Is anybody here completely new to Muldreth? Do you feel like you've been given good background? I do see some completely new faces. Now's the time to ask any questions. Okay.
And also hello and welcome.
Of course. Thank you for joining. Rory, shall we go to the proposed next steps so that we can continue with that? Because then we've got a bit of time. So Veronica, Veronica just posted in the chat as well that you're joining for the first time, Veronica, so welcome. And I hope everything's clear to you, but if you do have any questions or you're wondering why something was done a particular way, please ask. Or if you have any suggestions for how things could be done differently, please also share that with us as well. So some examples from the first session, for example, were you only found 26 research data lifecycle models, and how did you choose 5? We also had some discussion on sustainability and how we're going to achieve that going forward. So maybe we can discuss that afterwards. I will share screen for you, Rory.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have already touched on some of these, I guess, but Marcelo and Adam and I are planning to submit a proposal to have a follow-up working group, and our plans for the group are include the following things. So one, to continue developing the model. For example, we've already discussed the idea of having attributes that would be applied to individual tools like interoperability, closed or open source. And I think Adam also in his remarks earlier touched on some other ways in which we can continue to develop the model and possibly also continue to develop the visualization. And we are hoping get new blood in as well, other people involved, and we would welcome other ideas from new participants about how the model can continue to be developed. I'm going to go to this third bullet point, which is to explore sustainability options. And again, Adam touched on that important point as well in some of his comments about, I think, the sustainability of the, in particular, well, of the model generally, and also of the visualization, and also in the way in which he's developing the visualization to be extensible, which is important, as well as kind of, and this was a question which was raised in our first session about longer term sustainability as well. You know, what do we envision having working groups in the RDA for the next 20 years, keep having new ones come up? Well, probably that's not viable. I also am always somewhat skeptical about too much of a focus on sustainability, because at the end of the day, if something has value and has merit and it gets taken up, then it will be sustainable, because you don't really know how it's going to be sustainable until you find out if it's useful. If it's not useful, then frankly, it probably shouldn't be sustainable. But if it is useful, then ways, supporters for it will emerge. So we can look at options, but also we need to be cognizant of the fact that to some extent, that is an open question, which time will tell. I think the sustainability does relate to the interface and collaboration with the GORC groups, which CJ very nicely already outlined some of his thoughts, and even given us, I think, in this group, a few new ones today. So again, this kind of came up in relation to sustainability and also repetitiveness of some of the questions about the earlier, in the earlier session about the model. And people are saying, oh, well, it's just another model, and these models keep coming, they come and go. And to me, that another way of thinking about that is that the reason is because the time wasn't quite right, or the maturity of the environment wasn't quite right. I personally feel that with the advent of GORC and Maldreth taken together, in particular, if we're able to work together to develop and kind of co-develop what's been produced so far, we're potentially really onto something here that could actually become an important kind of conceptual underpinning of a lot of the things that have been discussed generally in research data management and open science and fair data over the last 5 to 10 years. And so I'm really keen on trying to facilitate that. And so clearly, I think we feel in this group, as CJ feels, that the interface and collaboration with the GORC groups it's got a lot of potential. And then last but not least, if anyone's interested in joining in this project, in this initiative, please do let us know. We really want to find others who'd like to be involved.
Thanks, Rory. So we do have time now for some general discussion. So if anybody has any comments, the floor is yours. We've got a very quiet audience today.
I'd also say if anyone really enjoys coding in R with Shiny or Python and Flask, they'd also be really welcome.
Yeah. So I've just posted a few prompts in the chat. These were sort of areas that we had discussed in the first session. So we had a few questions about our methodology and approach. We've also touched a bit about some future ideas and sustainability, and also usefulness and applicability, as well as the end product. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, it would be good to discuss. Okay. It seems like everybody has enough information. Oh, CJ, question for Adam. Is the visualization platform and code you're using open source?
Yes. I haven't actually declared a license for it yet. So it's all just standard library R with Shiny with GraphViz at the moment, and then I'm just the updated version had a slightly more complex set of packages attached to it, but you know, it's all open and simple, which is the standard way that I code.
Thank you. I think CJ's follow-up comment is they need to find a way to visualize the Gork model.
Yeah, I have ideas. I'll have to yeah, take that offline.
Yeah, please help us. We desperately need to have a different thing than a spreadsheet.
Yeah. There are the way that I've moved this off a spreadsheet, I think, is again something that will go into our output 3, but also I think we should look at from the Gork point of view as well, because I think there's some really good ways that we can test the kind of generalizability of what we're doing here to also look at that, and then also maybe slightly refine and, you know, produce a set of steps, approaches that will help.
Thanks, Adam.
Connie, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm just looking through the chat here, and I think it's really interesting. I think this is from you, where you've got a list of, are these the potential audiences, tools, developers, providers? And I think we might have actually come up with this ourselves at the very beginning, and I'd forgotten, but this is really interesting.
Yeah, I just took that from our original case statement, because
Yeah.
obviously the case statement at the beginning often with these groups and don't go back very often to really revisit it, which is a shame, because obviously that's where the initial thought process came from. I mean, it's probably quite an ambitious list of adopters there, but I think ultimately that was the idea, to try and include as many as possible. But I think, as you've already said, Rory, it's very much based on the product itself and the market at the end and how it's taken up, which you can't always predict.
Yeah. But I think actually that list is quite useful, and maybe something which in the discussions with the Gork group we could revisit that issue as well. Who the likely adopters are. As you say, it will emerge over time, but it's useful to keep reminding ourselves who the potential groups are, and that.
Mm-hmm.
And Hallie, I see that there's a question. Hallie's asked a question there. Is there a plan for revisiting or revising information as tools continue to develop capabilities and research fields change? Absolutely. And that's a key aspect that we hope to look at, or we plan to look into in version 2 of the working group, is both in the short term, actually, in the short term, having some periodic reviews so that even in over a year, that will change a little bit, incorporating changes which take place over a year, and in the longer term, figuring out a mechanism and a structure within Meldrith itself to make sure that what you describe is an ongoing process, an ongoing task, which is obviously a core part of sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rory, and thanks, Hallie, for the question. Andrea, also a group member of ours, she's posted in the chat, what would success look like for these outputs? I don't know who wants to answer that one.
Usage, generalizability, recognition of applicability across other similar works, and sustainability, and most importantly, people actually using it and finding it useful.
Yeah, and I see it particularly. I mean, I see kind of two immediate use groups, and we'll see if they take it up. And both of those are building. So it's to me, it's most. Again, this is just perhaps my own perspective, but I think it's most useful to people who are either building afresh or more likely continuing to build research infrastructures. And the three most common kind of categories of groups that are doing that are first institutions, so universities and research institutes. Like, for example, we had an example of the UCL version of the research data lifecycle, and actually you didn't see it because it's not too detailed, but in their version of the research data lifecycle, they actually have tools that they use in each category. So clearly, one would hope that an institution like UCL might find this useful as a reference, as a benchmark, as a source of ideas for tools. So that's the one category. The second category is people that are building research commons, global research commons, because again, if you're going to build a research commons or build up something to a research commons, the question arises that, arguably the key question, or one of the key questions is, well, what tools are going to be used at different parts of the life cycle? The incorporation of the life cycle into the life cycle concept into a research commons, to me, is critical. And then the third category is Elixir, for example. In other words, there are lots of domain, in many cases, extremely well-developed and rich domain infrastructures, or more likely conglomerations of unconnected infrastructures which exist. And they're now beginning to look at the research commons as and again, as a reference, as a model, and how can the domain infrastructures that exist incorporate some of the ideas of the GORC? And again, this services and tools element, which we've attempted to map in an organized fashion, again, which relates to the research data lifecycle, which to me is critical, is a critically relevant consideration for people like Elixir. So if we find that in conversations at universities, people building research commons, groups like Elixir, if we find that in these conversations, people are beginning to refer to the Maldwith model, to me, that's an important measure of success, or if not, then that's an important indication that maybe it wasn't so useful after all.
Thanks, Rory. Did that answer your question, Andrea? Thank you. So whilst we're waiting for any more questions to come in, actually, I just wondered, I have a question for CJ, actually. In our first session, CJ, we received the question or a comment really about automation, because obviously a lot of the work that we have done so far as a group has been manual and based on obviously the expertise that we have in-house within the group. So I wonder, because obviously you're you did that mapping, and you did that mapping manually against Maldwith and GORC, but also you've now got 400 different items or more within your GORC model. And so what's your view on sort of manual versus automated curation of these things, or do you have any thoughts on that? Has it been suggested to you before?
Yeah, that has been suggested to me before, and I think that the idea of automation is great. I think that if we could have a piece that automatically gives us a nice visualization, or automatically updates things, or can recognize concepts and automatically give a mapping that we just then read and revise, that would be great. But as far as I know, there are no AI models that can do that. There are lots of just scripting things that can make things easier, like with Adam's visualization. I imagine with the GORC model, we would set up a script that would automatically populate some things in R, like not to actually individually input all 7 columns for each of the 400 lines in the spreadsheet. That would be wild. So I think that automation has a place to play, but I just wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on automation when we're talking about mappings in particular. So mappings, I think, are things that we're going to have to do manually for now, or at least at the beginning. And then maybe as we get to like further versions of these models where they're changing a little bit, but they're not changing a lot, like their foundations are pretty stable, then I think that's when we could look at doing automated work for maybe fine-grained or very fine-tuned things. But yeah, I think mappings are definitely going to have to be manual, just because there's a lot of conceptual work behind it, and grouping categories together and saying like, oh, okay, is this an attribute versus a category versus a specific tool? We kind of need people to go in and do that manually.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
I will say that I've used large language models to build schema crosswalks, and so has Christian at DataSite, which are pretty much feature complete. And there are definitively, with slightly better trained models, really useful ways of building certainly the frameworks for these things. There's an automation question around kind of the actual, models and stuff that you're using, and the kind of genesis for the LLMs themselves. But there are certainly ridiculously good and powerful frameworks for this kind of thing at the minute. That is not the same as the actual kind of work that we've been doing from the point of view of identifying and matching stuff, and that really is kind of like human level stuff. And so there's been really interesting kind of work. So when I was at Gothenburg, we had a separate meeting around kind of like some schemas and stuff and some AI, and we were basically saying, I'd like to be able to translate from this thing to this thing, and it was more or less building either an XSL or a Python script that would do that. Now that's not something for the not quite so well defined work that we're still developing, but the actual kind of like finalized schemas and stuff, it was working really well and really simply. So again, from the point of view of the way that we've harmonized this from other RDLs to and from Maldorf, for example, I would be quite confident that automation would at least minimize the amount of actual effort. And I take very much the point about supervision and checking, and I don't think that we can trust, is that the right word? I don't know, the kind of outputs and stuff at the minute, but we can certainly save a lot of the basic work for maxing taxonomies of recoveries right now.
Thanks, Adam. So I guess we've got time for final question, and we might end up, I suppose, finishing a bit before the time if there is nothing to discuss further. I just wanted to say that we have one person, Hallie, who wants to join the follow-up group. So Hallie's put her details in the collaborative notes. Rory and Adam, so we'll follow up with you, Hallie. Okay, so with that, I think we can start to wrap up. I just want to say thank you very much to the presenters, to Marcelo, to Rory and Adam, but a special thanks to CJ for taking time out of your day at the last minute to join us. And I know you had a very early start with another session this morning, CJ, so thank you very much for your efforts in that. And I do hope that we can work together and this group can collaborate with the GORT group going forward. Thank you to you all as participants for joining today. I hope it's been useful and that you've learned something new about the group. If you do want to participate, in a future working group, please do add your details. We'll follow up. And our contact details are in the slides. So if you do want to reach out to us, it's the last slide. Please do that. I'll just put the link in the chat again in case you have lost that already. But otherwise, I'll let everybody drop off and enjoy the rest of their day. And I'll stop the recording. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.